Thank you, Jenny. Welcome, everyone. I was looking at the advertising that Jenny did for this program. She mentioned what I was going to talk about, and she specifically mentioned one of the odd positions in town government, the searcher and packer of pickled pork and beef. And so I was watching people come in, I said, that's why they came. So I'm not going to talk about it until the end so that you stay right where you are. I've been looking at this topic for quite a number of years of how Westport became a town. It was fairly frustrating because almost everything I read said the same thing, which was in 1787, Westport separated from Dartmouth and became an independent town. That was it. As if somehow it had just happened with a smile and a handshake. We knew there had to be more to it. Any kind of separation like that of a town or any sort of organization are always contentious. There's negotiations and there's accusations and winners and losers. As the great American philosopher Neil Sedaka would say, breaking up is hard to do. This certainly makes Westport's history, early history, a bit more complex, but I think a lot more interesting. I'm going to do this in this order. I'm going to talk a little bit about 1786. What were things like in 1786 when these events were brewing? Then get into the actual reasons why some group of people wanted to separate from Dartmouth. The actual process of that separation, what were the steps, what were the things that happened that made this actually lead toward independence. And then, once having achieved status as an independent town, how did the people of Westport form a new government, and what did that look like in the early days? 1786 is only 3 years after the end of the American Revolution. The United States had just defeated, or at least outlasted, the most powerful army and navy on earth. And you'd think they'd feel pretty good, but they didn't. And the reasons that they didn't were really that the United States at that point was under the Articles of Confederation. It was a very weak association of highly independent sovereign states. This is before the Constitution was drawn up. And the Treasury, the National Treasury, was completely empty. No ability to pay bills, to pay back war loans and so forth. And there was a post-war economic depression going on. Made much worse by the fact that the British Navy, now concentrating down in the Caribbean, was able to do a pretty good job at keeping the Americans from their traditional business of trading with the West Indies. It was a big business in New England, particularly, and especially along the South Coast, where we are here. Many people thought that the country wasn't going to survive as an independent nation. Here in Massachusetts, things were not much better. That depression was affecting everyone. The fact of the curtailment of the West Indian trade was particularly difficult here in Massachusetts. And Massachusetts was trying very hard to pay back its war loans. So they raised taxes to do it. And those taxes were a real burden on farmers in particular. There was no money in circulation. Farmers had a very difficult time paying their taxes or paying back their loans. And so they were subject to a lot of foreclosures and debtors' prison. So it was a really tough time, especially for those people. And it got so bad that there was an open revolt going on in Massachusetts that year, which was led by a man named Daniel Shays, who was a Revolutionary War captain, who sort of reluctantly ended up the leader of this group of people who had tried very hard to petition the state to ease the the restrictions on paying back loans and to have emissions of paper money to help debtors and so forth. Those attempts having failed, they took up arms. And there was a real, serious, open rebellion going on, mostly in the central part of the state. Their mode of operation was to shut down the county courts. So if the courts could not open, then there wouldn't be foreclosure proceedings and so forth. And that's what they were trying to do. And it was pretty bloody, lasted halfway from the middle of 1786 into early 1787. Eventually it was a military failure, but eventually it did make some changes. People realized the plight of the farmers, and there were legislative and other changes that did actually help these people. But the time that we're talking about, second half of 1787, early part of 86, and the early part of 87, there was still open rebellion in Massachusetts. You might think, actually, that this would be a time where you wouldn't want to separate from another town. You'd look for stability and say, well, things are okay maybe here in Dartmouth. Maybe I should just kind of stay where I am. Or someone could have said, well, you know, the national government's a disaster. The state government is putting down a rebellion. Maybe the smaller and more local, the most local the government could be, maybe there'd be something to say for that. Hard to know what people said. We don't have any direct indications of what people were thinking on that topic. But it was certainly a very disruptive time when these events in Westport are going on. Old Dartmouth, as we call it, the original Dartmouth, was very big. It was all of this area in here. And it had been bought from the Wampanoag Sachem, Massasoit in 1652 by a group of, I was going to say settlers, but they were really speculators, real estate speculators from Plymouth that bought 36 parcels, rather 36 very large parcels of land. And, but it wasn't until 12 years later that it became a town. 1664, Dartmouth becomes an incorporated town. In fact, they celebrated their 350th birthday just last year. And the lands, this is from their charter, the lands known by the name Acushnia, or Acushna, Ponagansett, and Coxet. That's the area that was covered by Old Dartmouth. Those are all names that we know. We still know these names or variations of those names today. Acushnet, Ponagansett, and Coxet. That's going to play into the story a little bit later on. Dartmouth was huge. It was the current towns that came out of Old Dartmouth are Westport, Dartmouth, New Bedford, Fairhaven, Acushnet, and slices of Tiverton and Little Compton. It was an enormous town, roughly 250 square miles. Very, very large by any town standard, in Massachusetts anyway. And it was made up really of a bunch of independent villages. There was Acushnet Village up at the head of the Acushnet River. There was Oxford Village over in what is now Fairhaven. Russell's Mills, Payden-Aram, Smith Mills, all in Dartmouth. And in Westport, there was, at the head of the river, there was a Coxet Village, which is actually where we are now. We're now, near the head of Westport. We're actually in what was a Coxet Village. And then down at the point, you can't really see it from here, but down at what we call Westport Point, was at the time called Pekachek Point. And we still use that name. The Pekachuk Inn is a variant of that now. And that was really the rest of Westport, or what we know now as Westport, and much of Dartmouth was just really farmland at the time. But they did have these 6 or 7 sizable, or relatively sizable, and somewhat independent villages. It's a very large town, especially east to west, and there are 6 or 7 rivers or large streams that go north-south. So it was very difficult to get anywhere east to west. If you were on the far eastern side, over in what is now Fairhaven, pretty tough to get yourself over to Smith Mills. Smith Mills was the center. It was the administrative center where the town hall was in Dartmouth. Smith Mills is roughly where the Dartmouth Mall is today. So that was the center of Dartmouth. But if you were over there, or if you were down at Peckacheck Point or various other places, it was a long ways to go, and you had to go around rivers, go quite a ways north before you could get a river to go in the other direction. So people who lived in these outlying areas had a very tough time getting to things like town meeting, or getting to do any sort of town business, register deeds, other kinds of legal work that involved the town. It was very hard to be able to get to those places. And that's going to clearly play into our story. The steps toward independence actually were triggered by events over on the other side of Dartmouth, over on the east side of Dartmouth. A group of people, this is in the summer or early fall of 1786, group of people from Acushnet Village petition the town of Dartmouth to separate and form an independent town. And they said, we want to be on the agenda for town meeting, which was in October. And they were. And the Dartmouth records don't tell us very much about the discussion. They said after a large discussion thereon, that's about all we know, they put it to a vote. And it was defeated 181 votes to 0. That 0 is a little hard to understand. All I can think of is that the people from Acushnet Village knew they were badly outnumbered and said, we're just going to boycott this vote. We're not even going to bother voting because it's going to look really lopsided, so we just won't vote at all. So it was a unanimous vote against that. But they had, well, let me back up here. They had a plan B. The ultimate decision makers on this were not the people of Dartmouth. It was the state legislature. They're the ones who incorporate towns in Massachusetts. So that was the ultimate decision maker. So what they did was they petitioned the state legislature. And they said, we have sufficient population to support a town. We've got government leaders. We've got a tax base. There's enough commerce. There's a whole bunch of reasons why we should be a separate town. And they also made the case that it was a long ways to go to town meeting. And the state said yes. So what really starts things going here is actually a new town formed in February of 1787 from the eastern part of Dartmouth. The biggest collection of people in that area was Bedford Village, which is where New Bedford is now. So they wanted to call the town Bedford, but there already was a Bedford, Massachusetts, so they very cleverly came up with the name New Bedford. And that's the town that we know now as New Bedford. But at that time, it also contained Fairhaven and Acushnet. So New Bedford originally was quite large. In 1812, Fairhaven separated from New Bedford, but that still included Acushnet. And then it wasn't until 1860 that Acushnet separated from Fairhaven, and then we have that collection of 3 towns that we have today. Needless to say, none of this was lost on the people of Acushnet over here, what had gone on. And they decided, why bother even going to Dartmouth town meeting? We know what's going to happen there. They went straight to the state, and they made their petition. One other thing I might mention here is that there was an event that may have anticipated some of this. 20 years before this, in 1766, the Quakers here in Acushnet, there were 2 Quaker meeting houses, and they were at the time under a Quaker meeting a group of Quaker meeting houses would fall under a monthly meeting, and the monthly meeting would fall under a quarterly meeting and so forth. And the monthly meeting was over at Pontiganset. In 1766, the people of the Quakers of Coxet formed their own monthly meeting. So now they were saying, we're on the same level, same administrative level as a Pontiganset. And in a sense, this kind of suggests what is going to happen over here in a Coxet, where they're saying, we don't need to be under Dartmouth, just like the Quakers didn't need to. I don't want to make too much of this, but it's more than a curiosity that it happened that way. And it may have encouraged some of this civil independence. Okay, so a Coxet, February 1787, just a few days before the official incorporation of New Bedford, the people of the Coxet put up a petition to the state. 125 people signed it. I've actually seen the documents on this. And they give their reasons, interesting reasons. One of them is that they say, if you look at the original charter for Dartmouth, it mentions these three areas, you know, including a Coxet. So it was meant from the start. It was like it was designed to be three towns. It's kind of one of these, you know, original intent kind of ways of approaching it. But they said, you know, even in the charter it says three different places. So they were meant to be three towns. We just want our right now to form a town out of a Coxet. He also said each village has as much land and inhabitants as convenient to constitute a town, which is actually correct. They had, at this point in a Coxet, what we call a Coxet, which is now Westport, there were about 2,400 people, about the same numbers as Dartmouth ended up with. So they had a significant amount of people, or at least enough to form a town. And they make that point about the rivers. Dartmouth is so divided by rivers, inconvenient going from one village to another to attend on town business. And they even get more specific. They say it's between 6 and 14 miles, depending upon where you are in a Coxet. 6 to 14 miles. It's a long way to go to get to town meeting or to get to Smith Mills for some sort of business. So on March 2nd, 1787, the House of Representatives looks at all this, and they send a letter to Dartmouth saying, doesn't seem like there's anything wrong here. How would you object to this? This sounds like something that we should allow. And it should have been easy. Oh, by the way, here's the only map we have from that time. I know you can't see it very well, but it says a Coxet village, approximately 4 miles, and it says a Pontiganset village, 6 miles. You can see Pekachek Point down here, but this dividing line, you know, we all know, anybody who's ridden on Division Road, you know that Division Road doesn't do that. So that's their original idea of just a perfectly straight line. It's not going to work out that way, needless to say. This would have been easy, except that a group of people living here in a Coxet objected to this separation. It would have been easier if there were a whole bunch of people here versus a whole bunch of people in the other part of Dartmouth. But in fact, there were a group of people living here in a Coxet who said, we don't want to do that. And they said that they don't want to do it because it caused a split in the town, which brought discord and disadvantage in the town. There's a few other lines along those lines indicating that there was some sort of emotional toll that was taken on these people. It was splitting people, families and friends who took different sides of this, and I guess it got heated at times. They also said at town meeting, they did have a town meeting after the fact, after Westport, after Coxet had already petitioned. They did have a town meeting in Dartmouth, and it was a unanimous vote, and they mentioned this in their their letter to the state. There wasn't a unanimous vote. Sounds very much like the one that happened in New Bedford, where the people who went there just didn't vote. But that's going to come up again. Someone else was against it. In this letter to the state, they say, the God of nature has so situated the town as to its conveniences and inconveniences that a division of the town will be very injurious to many of the inhabitants. This is interesting. The God of nature. Now, this is Enlightenment kind of language. The Enlightenment, the philosophical and scientific movement from Europe that came over in the 18th century over to here. And you find words like nature's God and natural rights and so forth. And we see it in a lot of documents. The Declaration of Independence is a wonderful Enlightenment document that talks about the laws of nature and nature's God. It's right there in the Declaration of Independence. What I found interesting here is that they're using the language of the Declaration of Independence to oppose the independence of the people of Akoksuk. They're also saying that Dartmouth should be a single town. So they're countering that idea that it should be 3 towns. They're saying, no, God really wanted it to be 1 town. And it should stay that way. They also have some practical arguments in there. One of them is that they say, quote, that a dividing line would divide some of the farms, which will render the sale of these farms very disadvantageous. That could be true. They said if a line were to go right in the middle of a farm and then divide the town partly in the new town and partly in Dartmouth, that might have some negative effect on the value of those towns. So here, at least they're getting a bit more practical, as opposed to deciding that God was on their side. And then, of course, the people who wanted to separate have to retort to this. They don't do it so much with, well, they do it with each other, but they do it through the state. They keep writing these back and forth letters to the state legislature. First of all, they say that town meeting wasn't a fair vote. Basically, what happened was the people of Akoksuk said, we'd like to have an Akoksuk meeting. Just the people of what will be the new town, and we want to get a poll of these people to see which ones are in favor and which ones are against and what the numbers might be. And so town of Dartmouth said that's fine, and they decided to do it 2 days before this town meeting that they're talking about. So 2 days before, they plan a meeting, but the weather is terrible, and so they have to call off the meeting. And they do, and they say to Dartmouth town meeting, we didn't get our meeting, we had to adjourn it, so don't vote on this at the next town meeting. Town meeting was 2 days later. The people of Dartmouth say, we're going to vote on this anyway, and they do, with very few people from Akoksuk there, because they didn't think it was going to be discussed, or hoped it wouldn't be. So what they say to the state is, yes, they did vote unanimously, but we weren't there because of these particular circumstances and bad weather. It also kind of reinforces their point that it's a long way and very inconvenient to get to town meetings. So I think it actually, in a sense, works to their advantage. Then it gets a bit more personal. What they say is, the people objecting to this are very good people. They say we esteem them as our fellow townspeople. But then they say, but for want of literature and instructive advantages in political affairs, together with being overbalanced by the love of private interest, they may not be enterprising in their discoveries of public advantages. In other words, these are very nice people, but they're too dumb to make a decision about, our town. It's a wonderful, I love that insult, they lack literature. I just think that's great. So we can call it the English major defense. And then, of course, they talk about themselves as the good guys. Those people, they lack literature, and they don't know much about politics, and they can't. They're not the kind of people who can make these decisions. We, on the other hand, are the good guys. And what they say is, they're talking to the legislature here. We ask that your honors would be generous and with generous and human affection would consider us the loyal subjects and friends of the Constitution of the government of the Commonwealth under all our embarrassments and disadvantages and our present standing and connection in this town. So they're the good citizens. They're the ones who understand the state constitution and all this other stuff. So they're the good guys. What you're also noticing here is a class element that has crept in, probably, anyway. We're the educated people, you're the country bumpkins. So there is a bit of class that's starting to show here. Okay, they finally do have, after the town meeting, they do have actually a meeting of the people here in Akoksik just to take a poll. They found out there's 123 people in Akoksik who are in favor of the split, 65 against. So they have close to a 2-to-1. And there's a bunch of other people. There are more polls in the town than this, more people who could vote. But they said even if they took all of the ones who haven't voted or who haven't shown their preference, even if all of them went against, we would still have a majority. So they've got a pretty clear majority. But they also say that if you were to take only 30 of the people who are in favor of separation, they pay more in taxes than all of the antis put together, including the ones who might vote. So now we see a wealth difference here. The wealthiest people wanted to separate. That's not across the board, but clearly if 30 of them pay more in taxes, in other words, have more land and more wealth than all of the others combined, then clearly the richest people are the ones who wanted to do it. There are other factors in here, and that is distance. I haven't been able to do a complete study of this, thanks to Richard Gifford here, who can make sense of census data the way I couldn't. If I looked at the names of the people who had objected and tried to figure out where they lived, it's a little hard to do because the 1790 census, the one closest to this, doesn't give any addresses. But with Richard's help, we're able to find out the pattern that the people are listed in, and you can kind of tell where they come from. And it's not 100% or maybe even 75%, but a good many of the people who objected simply lived close to Dartmouth. Maybe the people whose lands were going to be split, the people who lived at the head here, who weren't that far away from Smith Mill. So distance, it's not just class and not just wealth, but distance and convenience is also going to be one of the factors. Okay, July 2nd, 1787. Hope you all think of this year. July 4th will be coming, but on July 2nd, that's our real day, not July 4th, it's July 2nd, just before that. Westport gets its charter. And there are two things that I find really interesting about it. There's a lot of interesting things in the charter. And there's a copy of it in the town hall, in the selectman's office of the town hall is a copy, a very large copy of the charter. One of the things interesting is the name of the new town, Akoksik or Westport. Now, in all of the documents up to the charter, and I've seen quite a number of them, all the ones that are at least still around anywhere, state archives or wherever, Westport is never named. The word Westport is never used until the actual charter is put out on July 2nd. Now, Akoksik was the name of this area. It was Akoksik Village. The whole area was called Akoksik. The two rivers were called the Akoksik River. The East and West Branch at that time were called, East and West Branch of the Akoksik River. Akoksik, of course, with the Native Americans, the Wampanoags who had lived in this area. Akoksik was a name that had tremendous tradition and local value, really. Whereas Westport is a name that matters at the state level. Westport is, in fact, the westernmost port in Massachusetts, therefore Westport. But that isn't really much of a local phenomenon. It's really a state phenomenon. And so one possibility is that they were trying to curry favor and say to all these people who are going to be voting on it who are not from this area, saying, hey, wouldn't that be nice to have a place called Westport that kind of has some state meaning? I'm kind of grasping at straws here because I can't really figure out any other reason why they picked Westport over Coxet, but they did. Don't get me wrong, Westport is a perfectly good name. And it's much better than New Dartmouth. The second thing that's weird or unusual or interesting about this charter is that they made an odd concession to the people who didn't want to split from Dartmouth. And what it says, and by the way, this is in the New Bedford charter as well. What they said was, if you are now within the bounds of this new town called Westport, but you really want to be a citizen of Dartmouth, you can do that. You pay your taxes to Dartmouth. But anyway, it's in there. And a group of people, about 45 names, I think I counted, said that, as they said, we are citizens of a Coxet village who have a mind to belong to the town of Dartmouth. But they say, but do not call upon us to mend your highways, as it is a large distance for many of us to come. So they didn't want to pay their highway taxes to Dartmouth. They were kind of getting something out of it. So they appealed. What you had to do is pay all your back taxes, register to pay in Dartmouth, and actually you had to send a petition to Dartmouth town meeting. So Dartmouth town meeting says, oh, a bunch of people who live in the next town want to pay their taxes to us. Okay, unanimously accepted, not surprisingly. But of course, this is unworkable, absolutely unworkable. And I think, because it's in both the New Bedford and the Westport Charter, I think it might have been a way of just saying to the people, look, we'll give you a way out here, knowing that it wouldn't last. It was kind of like a sop to people, I think anyway. Within about 3 years, both Westport and Dartmouth agreed to abide by state adjudication on this. And the state judge said, we got to stop this. So within about 3 years, that was gone, and anybody who lived in Westport paid their taxes to the town of Westport. Okay, so now you got a charter. What do you do now? What's to be done? Well, first thing is, where's the center of government? Where are we going to build a town hall? And the big population centers, such as they were, of course, we mentioned, were right here, the head of the river, or Coxet Village became the head of Westport. And then down at the Point. Those were the two main areas. And they wisely chose not to seat the government in either of those places. They did it where there were good transportation routes and it was centrally located, which was, in this case, at the intersection of Main Road and Adamsville Road. So the first town hall, townhouse as they called it, was right there at that intersection. It was a wise decision. It was centrally located. There wasn't much there. It was just all farms, really, in that area. But it did have good transportation routes: Main Road, Adamsville Road, Hicksbridge Road coming out of it to the south. This road right out here, which was at the time was called Rhode Island Way, coming in from Rhode Island and going over towards Smith Mills. So they had pretty good transportation there, and that became the center of government. Central Village was then always the administrative center of Westport, right from the start. It was not a commercial center really until the early 20th century. The place to be was at the head, or if you like, bars and stuff down at the Point. There wasn't much going on at Central Village, but it was a wise choice to locate it as centrally as possible, and they did. They had to settle the boundaries. We saw that straight line going up above the division, but they really was and is still Horseneck Road, Division Road, and so forth. That did it. The Division Road boundary took until 1799, so over 10 years to settle that. But then in 1793, 95, 1805, there were various land swaps as they tried to really settle what the dividing line should be. And they finally settled it in 1828. It took 40 years to officially settle the boundary between Westport and Dartmouth. It took a long time. They also had public property. You know, if you had a town landing, who does it belong to? Well, if it was a Dartmouth town landing and it was now in Westport, it belongs to Westport. So a lot of those things were pretty easy. There was no almshouse in Westport, in Acoxet, so they didn't have to settle for anything like that. They did have some issues with caring for the poor. They actually wrote it out. These are the poor of Westport. And they named 6 or 8 people. These are the poor of, it's really kind of bothers you to even see this. These people named in town documents that they are the official poor. Because if you were in Westport now, but you had really come from that other part of Dartmouth, then they would say, we're not going to take care of you. So they were very strict about public welfare, especially until even when they had the town farm. The poor farm wasn't really established until 1824. Town organization. It was pretty easy to decide what kind of town government they were going to have because they didn't have any problems with the form of government in Dartmouth. There was no tyranny there. There wasn't anything that they had to rebel against. So they picked essentially the town government that Dartmouth had had, which was town meeting and the typical town offices that they would have. The first town meeting was in August of that year. They had to have it at someone's house because they didn't actually sort of an inn because it wasn't going to be until the next year that the new town hall would be built. But they chose the same names that we're familiar with now: a moderator, selectman, town clerk, treasurer, assessors, the usual ones that we still are quite familiar with today. There was a tax collector, there were constables. They're interesting because they were not paid a salary, especially the tax collector was not paid a salary. The tax collector would get a percentage of what they could collect. So obviously an incentive to go out there and collect more. The first year was 3% of what they could collect. But then the next year was 4%. After that it was 2%. Then it went up to 5%. Clearly it was political and would vary from year to year. You'd think that would be another one of those, would just be an unworkable system that they had to get rid of. And they did. But they didn't get rid of it until 1935. It was a very long time they had it. And I was trying to wondering why, but then if you think about it, 1935, in the depths of the Depression, the Great Depression, it's probably very hard to collect any sort of money during the Depression. And so they opted for a salary system instead of a percentage of what they could collect. They also had highways was a big thing. There were 12 separate highway surveyors, each with a section of town that they were responsible for. They had to repair the roadways and clear snow and so forth. Everyone had to pay back then, just like those people we were talking about before. You either had to pay money for the roads, or you had to supply equipment, or oxen, or horses, or something like that. Every taxpayer was responsible to pay for that. We don't have any record of whether those people who squiggled out of their Dartmouth highway taxes, whether they had to pay them in Westport or not. I really don't know. I suspected that they would have had to. And then we have some unusual positions. Fence viewers. Okay. Fence viewer was to inspect fences between neighboring properties and to resolve disputes if they happened. And they did happen. If your hog got out and got into your neighbor's garden, they could do a tremendous amount of damage in no time. So that was a really important thing. The rule was that a fence was supposed to be horse high and hog tight. And that pretty much does it. And, surprisingly, there are still 3 fence viewers in Westport. In our town government, there are still 3 fence viewers. So that has lasted from the very earliest of colonial times. A hog reeve. If your hog got out, the person who went and chased it down was the hog reeve. and would bring it over to the pound keeper at the pound where strays of various sorts were kept. You paid a fee or a penalty if your hog or some other animal got loose. You had to pay to get it back. This is, of course, a clear indication of the kind of agricultural town that Westport was. Here's the one everybody loves. Searcher and packer of pickled pork and beef, and I'm not going to even try to say it again. I like this one, not just because it's a weird name, but searcher in the sense of inspector, and packer. Sometimes in other towns, like in Boston, it was the packer of barreled pork and beef. Barreled. They're packing this stuff away for a reason. If you've got beef and your neighbor has salt, you might just swap with them. But in this case, it's suggesting an export business. That export business was always very important in Westport, as I was mentioning earlier, even though the British were trying to keep Americans out of the West Indies. That was an extremely important part of Westport's or Dartmouth's shipping business, the carrying trade to the Caribbean. And what you needed was somebody, after you had taken this beef or pork or whatever it was, and salted it and preserved it and packed it in barrels, you needed somebody to inspect that barrel. And if you said this is a hogshead of 31 gallons or whatever, it better be a hogshead of 31 gallons in good shape. And so they're a very good indication of not just an agricultural business, but an important export business. And while I'm still on that, there was also the color of hoops and staves, barrels. So somebody there, in association with the pickled pork and beef, was also checking to make sure that these hogsheads or barrels were of the right size that they claimed to be and the right quality, and that the hoops were well made and they weren't just going to break apart on a voyage down to the Caribbean. So again, an indication of a very important export business. Color of dried fish, same thing. A color, you cull things out, cull out the bad stuff. In other words, an inspector of dried fish. Again, you might be a fisherman and trade so many cod with a neighbor for sugar or something that they had. And that went on. There was all kinds of trading and bartering going on, to be sure, in the local economy that didn't have much cash. But again, somebody is inspecting this fish to make sure this is all cod. They don't have something else in there. This is cod or whatever it purports to be. And it's official, and we're going to put it in an officially sanctioned barrel, and we're going to send it off down the coast or to the islands or down to the West Indies. Real important indications of the kind of business that were important to Westport at this time. I'm going to end with my favorite, the tithing men. We think of tithing as something that's church-oriented, giving a tenth of what you have to a church. And it was originally very much church-oriented. In colonial times, the tithing man was the person who went around and made sure that people went to church, especially in the Puritan communities. You had to go to church, and so they would force people to go there, and they would just get them there. And then once they were there, they had these long poles. And if they caught somebody sleeping, they would go and whack them, which is kind of what's going on. The kids playing around, they're going to whack them. They were really fun people, as you might guess. And but their jobs became a bit more generalized over time. I have a description, not from Westport. Westport records don't have a particular one, but in other towns, this is a typical one. Their job was to inform on all idle and disorderly persons, profane swearers or cursers, Sabbath breakers, or the like offenders, to the intent that they may be punished. These were the moral police. That's what they did. They also spent a lot of time looking for people who were drinking in unlicensed establishments, and that was what the tithing men did. 1787, Westport gets started, and they have 2 tithing men. A few years later, they upped it to 4. And apparently there were a lot of disorderly swearing Sabbath breakers in town because in a few years there were 10 of them. By 1823, there were 15 tithing men. Westport had become a moral swamp. But I'm happy to report that since 1836, there have been no tithing men in Westport, proving that by then, Westport people had become the good, moral, upstanding people that we all are today. And that's how Westport became a town.